Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jeff Morton, your host for Let's Talk About It. I have a couple of minutes that I need to take. I want to take a few seconds just to say thank you to some of the folks who've contributed to keep me doing this podcast. I really was struggling with whether or not to go ahead and pay for all of this all over again, and the price increased, and we've been off the air for a couple of weeks because I was trying to figure out what to do. And then several people came alongside of me and said, yeah, we'll help you out. And then I have a very important show coming up, which I'll mention here in a minute. And so there were just some things that kind of connected to where, go forward. And today is the first day after being gone for 2 weeks, and I'm happy to be here. I want to tell you about the show next week. I'm going to have a person by the name of Christina. She is from Germany. She's going to be talking about show up or glow up, achieve your richest life possible. She's a friend of a friend. And I talked to her and I thought, yeah, that sounds like a good fit for the program. So she's going to be joining us next weekend. And then on February the 16th, I have a very important show. Many of you know that I was very vocal about the mask mandate and all the things that Washington State imposed upon the citizens through the government. There's an attorney who represents John Stockton, who was a famous basketball player. He's retired now. I reached out to him because he's been involved with some lawsuits fighting the state of Washington, more specifically the Washington Medical Commission, and 2 doctors who are being sued by this organization. We've been going back and forth for about 6 months. Well, he got a hearing before the Supreme Court. They kicked it back down to the appellate court. And we've been talking about putting him on the program along with Dr. Thomas Seiler, I think it's Seiler, and Dr. Richard Eggleston. And they're countersuing. And obviously, COVID was a big deal for me because we weren't allowed to hear the opposing sciences. So these guys are going to be on the broadcast tentatively on the 16th of February. I'm actually booked through the rest of the month. So I'm happy about that. It's kind of like the blessings happened. Keep moving forward. I'm also looking for the right person to come alongside and help me promote the program on various social media sites as well as podcasts, Apple and whatnot. And that search is ongoing. We are also looking for sponsors because I really could use some funding. And so if you've got an advertisement 30 to 45 seconds long that I can charge you to run on the podcast every week, I will do that. We'll talk about those costs if you give me a call. The number is 253-448-4777. So those are my notes that I needed to talk about to get the show started. I want to thank you for joining me. And my guest, I reached out to a very, very good friend of mine, Dr. Dina Dye, and I said, Dr. Dina Dye, who would be the best person that I could reach out to be on the podcast? And she wrote me back and said, I really don't know. So then she contacted me a few minutes later and she said, you ought to get to know Matt Nappier and have a conversation with him. He's a wonderful person. He's just finished getting his PhD. So Matt Nappier, Dr. Matt Nappier is going to be joining me. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having
me on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here.
I'm glad you're able to join me, man. Dina spoke so highly of you, and of course she is, if I can support her 7 ways sideways because I just get where she's coming from, what she's been teaching for the last 45 years. And she highly recommended you to be another voice in this whole thing that's happening in our lifetime. So welcome to the podcast. I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Dina's very generous. She's a very good friend of ours. She's been to our house and stayed with us. We've done Sukkot together, different events and speaking events. So she's very generous, but she's really great. She's someone to look towards for sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, folks, just as a side note, we're not live on Rumble. This is, I don't know why, so I have to go study that out, but I got notification that we're not broadcasting live on Rumble. I don't know why this keeps happening, but we'll figure it out. Anyway, Matt, give me 5 minutes of your best history. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I grew up in West Monroe, Louisiana, which is generally where I live now. If people may be familiar with the Duck Dynasty crew, that's same hometown as them. See them all the time. We actually rent their camp for our church every year. So grew up here, went to high school. When 9/11 happened, I was a senior in high school and decided to join the military as a response to that. So I served 22 years on active duty in the Army. Did a lot of great things there that I really love. Uh, just now, as I'm out and working outside of the military, realizing all of the very great things that impacted me through my career, my service. So one of my highlights there in the picture, I was a drill sergeant, one of my favorite parts of my career. I love lead troops. And there were several times in my career because I got an undergraduate degree from the University of Louisiana at Monroe. And when you get a degree, they start kind of pressuring you to become an officer. And then I got a master's later and they pressured me some more. But I stayed as a non-commissioned officer because I love troops. I love leading troops. I love leadership. And so I stayed with it. And but the Army served me well. It provided for me to be able to have lots of benefits even now, but of course my educational benefits as well. In 2007, I met my wife, Melissa. We met in probably September 2007. She refused to go on a date with me until January of that year, of the next year, January 2008. And then we got married in July 2008. So
wait. Back up for a second. She refused to go on a date with you for months?
Yeah, well, I mean, long story short, she had come out of a long relationship and just wasn't ready, and I was patient. She was a barista at the coffee shop that I was a regular at. As a matter of fact, the first thing we said to each other, her first night at work, I'd been coming there for a long time. It was about 8:30 at night. I ordered a triple shot of espresso with a splash of milk, and she asked me how I slept at night, and I said, "Well, most normal people close their eyes and lay their head on the pillow and go to sleep," and she kind of rolled her eyes, and so it was, fireworks from there. But and so finally we started dating in January of 2008. We got married July that year. So we didn't take our time at all. We were ready to jump into it, and marriage has been a blessing. I mean, as you know, there's tough times, there's good times, but well, as we got married, we were both in college. So I was in my undergrad at the time, still in the Army, and she was getting a degree in speech language pathology. And so she and I actually graduated at the same time. She's much younger than me, 5 years younger than me, but because of my career in the Army, my education was a little delayed. And so we graduated college together. We both, she started her master's. I did not start my master's for another 6 years, which was a good thing. I had wanted to go into gerontology. I love the elderly. I love nutrition in the elderly. Matter of fact, something I don't think I told you, Jeff, I owned a business for 5 years that was very successful, nutrition business. Sold it in 2015.
Really?
And after I sold my business, I finally figured out what I would want to continue education in. And so I went to Amridge University. It's a private Christian university. Got a master's in biblical studies. Spent most of my master's really in the ancient Near Eastern background to the Bible, cultural context. I took 2 years of Hebrew and then more Hebrew in my PhD, a year of Greek. I say a year, 2 semesters of Greek, a semester of Aramaic, and 2 semesters of Akkadian, the language of the Assyrians.
Right.
And so I did a lot of background studies, archaeology, languages and archaeology mostly in my master's. And then immediately from there, I went right into my doctorate, my PhD in Old Testament, where I'll tell you, when I started my education in biblical studies, I wanted to stay within Genesis through Deuteronomy. I thought, man, I've got a lot to add here, and I can do some work here, and I can, and then I never wanted to go into Hebrew poetry or the prophets. And, my doctorate, I spent the entire time in the Hebrew poetry and the prophets. So my dissertation was in the book of Micah.
I'm going to jump in here for just a minute, because while you were doing all of that, you were producing kids.
That's right. Yeah. So we had 3 children by the time I got my master's. Matter of fact, when we graduated with our undergraduate, she was pregnant. Nobody knew it. She was pregnant with our first child in 2000. 2011, and then and then we went on to have 3 more children by the time I graduated with my master's. And while I was getting a doctorate, we had two more children, so a total of 5 kids. And
So
funny,
you've got three girls and 2 boys. But go ahead.
yeah. So one interesting thing that I always tell people is we're all M names. So I'm Matt, obviously. Right. My wife is Melissa, and then my children are Mariah, Maya, Michaela, Malachi, and Michael. And we have 2 dogs, 2 standard poodles named Mia and Molly. So we're all M's.
Why the M? What was that all about?
Well, when we got married, it was 2 M's, and our first child, I always said if I had a girl, I wanted to name her Mariah. It's Moriah. It's like Mount Moriah. And then we went to have a second child, and we thought, man, if we give her any other name than starts with M, she'll be slighted. She'll think, well, I wasn't good enough for the other M's. And so then it just kept going.
Well, okay. So now we brought you up to date. You're going to walk for your doctorate coming up here. When is that going to happen?
Yeah. So I defended my dissertation back in July, and I really finished up the last manuscripts back in August. Our university does 1 graduation. So this May I'll walk for my graduation. I'll be, hooded for my doctorate and everything like that. So
congratulations.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things. There's so many things that I want to just kind of tip my hat to you for. Number one, 9/11 spurred you to go in and defend the country. Then while you're in there, you decide you want to go back to school. You end up getting a master's degree and now a doctorate. You're married. You produced 5 kids. You kind of did an awful lot.
In the middle of that,
last 10 years.
Owned a retail business, and we live on a farm. So I used to have a working farm. Now we just have cows and chickens, and so not so much work. We have low maintenance animals, but we live on 60 acres here in Northeast Louisiana.
Wow,
that was a project in itself. Yeah,
you're starting to sound like Pastor Joe Amon.
Joe, yeah, he's in the same state. He's down in Southwest. Yeah,
I visited him. Been to his home. Been to his congregation. He's a good guy. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of the conversation here, because you were not always a person of faith.
That's right.
Start there. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I just lived a wild, very wild life growing up. I always joke with people that I never really got in a lot of trouble growing up. I should have been arrested probably many times. My parents should have caught me doing a lot of stuff, but I was just, I guess, sneaky. And so did all the things of the world that you can imagine. We won't even go into details. And then I deployed to Afghanistan with the Army. I was there for 12 months, a long deployment, 15-month deployment, 12 months in country. And I was out in the middle of nowhere the whole time with a, small platoon and some other people. I mean, at one point we were on a FOB that had like, around 50 people out in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan. And so I had an interpreter who would always tell me, he would always say something along the lines of, "You're my brother," and I was like, man, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not your brother. But he was very kind. I love the guy. I mean, I still, I'm not connected with him. I'm connected with his brother who got asylum here in the U.S. But he would always say I was his brother, and I never understood. I thought he was trying to convert me or something. But he would always, just like most Muslims, he would pray 5 times a day. And I was just kind of overcome and overwhelmed. I mean, I grew up in the Bible Belt, so I'd been around church. Lived with my grandmother a little bit growing up, so she always took me to church. But I'd never seen devotion quite like that. A very kind devotion at that, And so that just kind of stuck with me. And then I come back from my deployment, had some rough times. I mean, heavy into drinking. A lot of people responded differently to. I wasn't just so traumatized from my deployment, but I had some guys that I was with that really went off the deep end. But we had a joke. Mardi Gras is big in Louisiana, and Mardi Gras is associated with the time between Epiphany and Easter, and Lent is in the middle of that. And so we had a joke one year that, what are you going to give up for Lent? And I jokingly said alcohol, and everybody knew that I would never give up alcohol because I just drank every night. But one thing I am one to take a challenge. And so I stopped drinking cold turkey overnight as a bet to give it up for Lent. And 17 days into Lent, my life collided with the God who had been chasing me for a long time, and I grabbed a Bible, went to my favorite park here in town, and just me alone on a park bench. I spent the entire day reading and weeping and crying out to God. And no Roman road, no come down to the altar and pray a certain prayer, but I prayed a prayer that day that I committed my life to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I told him, I looked back to the time where my interpreter would just be so dedicated to his faith. And I said, God, I know there's way more to faith than what I've experienced. I know there's way more to your people than what I've experienced. And if you would just give me the wisdom, I had no idea what I was praying at the time. If you would just give me the wisdom, give me the knowledge of how you would want your people to look, I will be committed to you forever, and even at times where I've, gotten into a slump, God never has. He's poured into me and given me way more wisdom and knowledge of him than I ever thought that I would have. So that's my testimony of coming to faith.
Okay, so you came out of the alcohol, you avoided the PTSD. Did you see combat?
I did, yeah.
Okay, so
I wouldn't say I avoided PTSD. I just wasn't affected as much as some. I mean,
okay,
some people, yeah.
All right, that's probably a better way to say it. So now you're back home. You decided you're going to study. How did that happen? I mean, what happened to cause you to want to go to a Christian college to learn about Israel? And how many times have you actually been to Israel now? Because you mentioned, I read you had done some tours.
Yeah, it's been a few times. We got halted in some of our touring due to the conflict since October 7th. But how I really got into study, I mean, I had a Bible and I had my God who, like I said, he collided with me whenever I finally slowed down enough, and I could realize he was chasing me. And when you go from going to a bar every night and waking up and going to work and doing it all over again to not drinking, if you talk to anybody who drinks, it's not fun to go out with people who are drinking when you're not drinking. So I just stopped going out altogether and had that experience 17 days into Lent, and picked up the Bible. And that's actually how I ended up at the coffee shop. I started going to the coffee shop instead of the bar. And I was just reading the Bible every night. So within 6 months, I had read the Bible through twice. And, I tell people my experience with the Bible is kind of unique, a little bit from Western, or at least the Bible Belt. All of my friends, and I do a lot of ministry opportunities outside of my own church. And the question always comes up for new believers, where do you start reading? And all my friends will say John or Matthew. And I say, you start reading in the beginning. Right. And they've asked me, like, why is that the case? And I said, well, when I came to be a believer, I didn't have anybody pointing me to the book of John. I picked up a book and I started reading it the way that I would start reading any other book. And I fell in love. I think a lot of times we think the Old Testament's boring because we're told the Old Testament's boring. But if we picked it up and read it with no preconceived notions, it's a beautiful story, So that's how I just fell in love with the Bible, fell in love with God and his word. And so it would have been from that period till the time I actually went to school for biblical studies was about 10 years, maybe a little bit more. And I went to school. I'll tell you, I said I wanted to learn Hebrew. I didn't really want to do it on my own. And I said that I still had some military benefits for education. And I thought the Army will pay for me to learn Hebrew. That's really what happened. And then I fell in love with biblical education. I fell totally in love with biblical education after that. So that's kind of how all that happened.
So you mentioned the word Bible Belt. Okay. You were out drinking and partying and trying not to get caught. So you weren't sitting in church. No. Praising Jesus.
That's
but
right.
Then something happened. The Lord got a hold of you, and now all this Israel stuff, all this Hebrew stuff. I mean, that's not what we Christians are taught. We're taught, we started the book of John, and by the time you get to Revelation, all hell's going to break loose, and eventually we're going to be able to lift it up out of here. How is your biblical understanding different now? And I'm going to give you a lot of time to explain this.
Yeah, how's it different than kind of our normal understanding?
Our traditional understanding of the Bible. Yes.
Yeah, and again, I had a very non-traditional coming to faith, and then a non-traditional experience in the church. Once I came to faith, I went back to the Methodist church that my grandmother kind of took me to, and started going. But I was just passionately in love with the Word. I kept reading, and I started asking some questions like, what's up with this? Why have I never heard this? Why is this never taught? And those questions really can be uncomfortable for people that aren't ready to
Yes.
address them. And in hindsight, I kind of asked a lot of questions, um, and maybe should have slowed down a little bit, but in hindsight, I kind of realized that it could have been intimidating when these things traditionally aren't taught. And so I actually linked up with a guy who was a radio show host for a Christian radio here locally. They were giving away a free book. So I'm like, I'm a reader. So I'm like, I'll go get a free book. And he kind of was like, hey, there's something different about you. Stay. You have time to stay and we'll chat. Turned into a friendship. He's about twice my age, maybe a little bit less than twice my age. And what started happening was we all went, me and him, and then there was another guy and his wife. We all went to different churches. And then after church on Sunday, we'd all join up together and study the Bible for hours every Sunday evening, afternoon into the night. We'd go to dinner Sunday night after we'd study the Bible all day. And one day there was Bill, who's a very meek man, friend of ours. He kind of just shyly said, guys, I think that we should be doing this yesterday. And we said, what do you mean, Bill? He said, well, I'm reading through the Bible and I see all these references to the Sabbath, and I think that was yesterday. And so then I started digging a little bit deeper into what are the things that God has said are forever that maybe we don't understand as forever? What are some things about God's people that has been said as far as how we act and how we behave and how we represent God that are different today than what I see in my scriptures? And so that kind of led me down that path to start saying, let me dig deeper and see, let me see what's going on here. And so I realized I'm a citizen of a kingdom here and now, and that citizens are have a responsibility to represent their nation, but more importantly, that we as the citizens of God have the obligation and the responsibility, but also the privilege of representing our God. So all of those type of topics kind of led me down a path to say I've got to know more and more, if that makes sense.
It does, because for me it was an epiphany. I was like, oh my God, my salvation is the beginning of my obligation. I've been saying that for several years now. Well, what am I obligated to? So I too went back and started reading from Genesis. I started reading those first 5 books, and I'm going, wow, the entirety of how to behave as a citizen in the kingdom to promote life, justice, and all the things that Yeshua died for, Jesus died for. They're all right here. And I'm going, wow, we don't know this. We're not being taught this. And the epiphany started happening over and over again. And I went, wow, if I'm in a covenant relationship with my king, covenant means I'm obligated to do a few things. And so myself, I started looking for anybody and everybody who could teach me about the Sabbath and about the festivals and all these things. We all kind of go through the Hebrew roots thing, the Messianic thing, but ultimately it boils down to, for me anyway, that I'm a citizen of the kingdom and I have an obligation to represent what that means. And I think that's kind of what happened with you, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And then learning more about how we read our scriptures is really what kind of deepened that for me. So most of my focus through my doctorate was really honed in on the literary genres of the Bible. And I came to realize that we misread those all the time. We don't quite read the literature of the Bible as well as we should. That's how I got into Hebrew poetry. I mean, we read Hebrew poetry as if we flatten it out as if it's a narrative, and then we start just misusing it all the time. And so then I started just kind of reading it for what it's worth and how it's intended. And so then you realize that, all throughout the Bible, you have this beautiful story of God who's working to redeem people back to where he intended, which is back to the Garden of Eden. And he's trying to show his love for his people through these really wonderful acts throughout creation that obviously climaxes with Jesus and his crucifixion and resurrection. And the entire time from the front to back, there's this response that's expected, that because of God's love, we're expected to behave as if we are thankful for those gracious acts that he's done for us. And so that was a huge thing for me, realizing that in response to the loving acts of God, that again climaxes with Jesus in his death, burial, and resurrection, that I have this. It's hard for people to hear the word obligation, but we would say obligation with any other context. If we talk about our spouse, we're obligated to love and do things for our spouse, not because we have some type of regulation that makes us against our will, but because of what we've done for our spouse, what they've done for us. And so that really shifted my mindset. How can I live better? And what does it really mean to imitate Christ? Which is said a couple times.
Well, for me, it was not only that, but also, my children. I have an obligation to represent the King of Kings in the lives of my kids. That's not something they were raised with. And as I began to realize that the responsibility to show the light of the kingdom it's up to me. It's not up to me. It's not up to the pastor. It's not up to the epiphany that hasn't happened and may never happen. It's up to me understanding what, and you said it quite well with the poetry. For me, it was the cultural integrity and looking at the lens, what those people were writing about. Because I got to tell you, if what those people were writing about in the context of their cultural reality in the mythological world, the poetry you mentioned, the analogies, and all of these things that we don't have because we're always looking back with our lens to their story. We're never looking at their story from their lens, which is, not to say that that's always the case, but traditionally we're imposing our understanding of the text on the writers as opposed to what was it like for them when they were writing about all these things. And so for me, the more scholarship I read, the more academic stuff that I read, I began to see a people as opposed to a spiritual thing alone. I began to see that we're a product of those people, not something new. And I began to identify, and I literally had a huge epiphany when I was in Greece and Turkey, and we're not different from those people, but let's see what those people were talking about. That's been transformative to me. For me, and I got to say this, that kind of made me look at the biblical story, as it's such a beautiful story. But it also, I started looking at the story as though, even though we're not the audience that they were talking to, it was meant for us as well. It stood the test of time, and I'm going, if these things were relevant then, and if my king doesn't change, then they're relevant now. And so I began to realize I have to really understand what this concept being grafted into Israel really means. And so those are the kinds of things that have encouraged me to understand the Bible from a completely different perspective. And I have to be mindful of Pastor Mark Biltz. He said, you can't rip what people know out of their chest. You have to park something up next to it. And of course, once you start studying academically and really studying the biblical story, it becomes easier to park something in the lives of people as opposed to force it upon them. And I had to learn that. I actually had to learn that lesson. So for me, it's kind of like, God, take a second look at what we're missing. Because the beauty of what we're missing is far bigger than what we do have and what we've embraced. And I think that's probably what my driving force. And I know you will agree with that.
100%. You said a couple things there. I know you had, I know John Walton says it and some other scholars. I don't know if anybody knows where it exactly came from, but I know you had that in your background of what you're saying, that the phrase that the Bible was not written to us, but it was written for us. And,
right.
And the idea when you started speaking there just then, that the people that wrote the Bible were much like us. I can't remember exactly how you said it, But I said something a few years back. I was teaching a course, and my friend, one of my best friends, Matthew, he heard me make this phrase, and so he actually made it stick. I just said it and moved on. But I was doing some translation work early in my doctorate, I think, or maybe my master's. I was doing some translation work of some old tablets, some ostraca, some ostracon, some old like nothing. So an ostraca is just like a potsherd, like we have sticky notes. And but back then they didn't have sticky notes, and so if a clay pot broke, they wouldn't throw it away. They would keep it because then that would be something they could write a sticky note on or send a short message to someone. And so I was reading one. I tell this story often, so I should get the reference. I don't have the reference handy. I should memorize the reference, but I was reading one, and it went along the lines of, "Hey sis, this is your brother. We'll say John. Just writing to check in with you to let you know I'm still coming to see you and mom next month. I hope you got the pack, or I hope you liked the package that I sent with the courier. See you soon. Be well." You know, and I thought, man, that sounds just like something we would write today, except for it was on a potsherd instead of in an email or a text message. And so I say often when I talk about the history of the Bible, I love to teach about the history of the Bible. I always say that people have never changed. Like we have these thoughts of evolution and all this stuff. Like people have never changed, only technology has. And so how we're able to do things changes, but not people. And that helps us really, for me, it helps me and I've seen it help others connect to the Bible. Because often we look at this as if it's some crazy ancient text and how could it even be applicable to me? But when we realize there are people just like Matt and Jeff, then we're able to connect to it. And then if we really learn how to start reading it responsibly, then it'll really impact our lives and we can live as citizens of God's kingdom should. And you mentioned there the cultural, the historical cultural background is where I spent a lot of my time in my master's, but that is so linked and intrinsic to the literary genres and the literary context. I'll give you one example that I know you're very familiar with is just our creation story in our Bible, where, a lot of people, they'll hear that I'm an Old Testament scholar. And so one of the first questions they'll ask me was like, do you think that the world was created in 6 literal days? And my response is, that's not the right question to ask. And I have to be careful with that question because I've had people get really offended when I respond that way. What do you mean? That's the question I want to ask. But, my point is that's not the right question because that's not anywhere in the vision or the view of the author who penned Genesis creation story. I would suggest that it's written in a very unique style that's almost a poetic narrative, but it's also most importantly a polemic against the world around it that, like you were saying earlier, only we can understand best if we understand how the first people who heard it understood it. And so when we see creation stories like the Babylonian myth of Marduk and Tiamat, where creation is born out of violence and Tiamat is chopped up and she's pinned to the heavens and put in a jail under the seas to create the waters and separate the waters, we realize that I always like to say that God, when it says God speaks, I always like to imagine that God whispers creation into existence, because that's the epitome of the counter-cultural idea that they had at the time, that creation came out of violence. Even in Ugarit, in Ugarit, they had the god Baal who battled against Yam, the chaotic sea monster, and creation was born there. And so that's how my two worlds of my master's degree and the work I did in my doctorate kind of collide, where the culture helps us understand the literary genres better. And so, that's what I mean when I say we've got to read responsibly and know what we're reading and what was intended. And ultimately, we have to read it for what is the message behind it. And that's what I mean when we're asking the wrong question about Genesis, because the message of the creation story is that God didn't have to fight anybody to create the universe. And on the 7th day, he rested. I used to think that he went to bed, because that's how we rest. No, it's kingship language. God resting is him sitting on his throne. That was the inauguration of the king of the universe. Is Genesis 1. And so God sits on his throne and now he's reigning over all creation. And what does he do? He creates man to be his image, and to go, and he tells them, man and woman, you're going to reign over creation for me. He gives authority to man to do what was intended when he sat on his throne the seventh day. And I always tell people the gospel story doesn't start in Matthew. The gospel story starts in Genesis 3:15, when God told the serpent that the consequence of his actions were that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. And again, we see literary genre and we see cultural context come into play, because we don't have a clue what that means in the Western world. What does it mean that a seed would crush a serpent's head? Until we find things like pharaohs, tombs of pharaohs in Egypt, who had footstools, something we see all throughout Scripture. And on their footstools, we see men. And as we understand and look at who these men are depicted on their footstools, they're the enemies of Egypt. And so culturally, we have this picture of a king who sits on his throne and puts his enemies under his foot. And that's what the gospel message was. God promised to redeem creation by putting the enemy of God's people underfoot. I love that. I think it's King Tut, actually. I can't remember. I know it's his throne, but I can't remember if it's his sandals. One pharaoh actually even had sandals with his enemies on his sandals. So no matter where he went, he was constantly putting his enemies under his feet. And so that's, for me, that's a beautiful thing. I love looking at the Bible and understanding it that way.
For me, I've got a book on the shelf over there. It's written by a very, very prolific anti-Semite. I can't think of his name, but he's writing about the various ceremonies, in order to be born again and the breath of life and all these things, and how if you were to become, let's say, a person in Pharaoh's court, you had to be born again, and he would take his breath, and that made you godlike because their world was mythological and he was the god, and he would appoint you by blowing into your nostrils. And so I was reading his material and I'm going, this is what Moses was talking about. And so I began to see the different story that all of the ancient world would have known. It didn't have to be explained to them, and it just fell into place. And then when you mentioned the seventh day, I went, oh my God, Dina taught me this, and I heard it from someone else. I think there's another book over there, but the seventh day was when order had destroyed chaos, and the king was enthroned. And of course, we see that with Joshua. God gave him rest. We see that with David. So, and then we see in Hebrews when it says, come, be a part of my rest, be a part of my order, be a part of my kingdom. And so all of this language began to paint a different picture. And I agree with you. Human behavior doesn't change. One of the things that occurred to me while I was in Greece is they were talking about all the armies that came over the hills into Turkey, just these wars that went on. And I went, well, Paul and Silas were running around over there. These guys were all fighting and doing much the same thing that any place in the world is doing today. And I went, nothing's really changed. And yet the mercy, the grace, and the love of the story of the Bible is still unfolding. It's just our turn. And I just love the fact that it's our turn. I'm really loving this conversation because, when I started reading their cultural understanding of the text we were reading, and then those who organized the text, a few hundred years later, I was like, there's so much in here that if you just read line by line and don't take a peek at what this stuff means or even look at the Hebrew, you're going to miss 90% of what is actually happening. And I unfortunately think that we have a lot of traditions built on what was missed. So I'm always trying to get people to go back and take a look, which is exactly what you did. Well, actually, you didn't even go back. You just learned because you didn't have all of this information. You didn't have the tainted traditional stuff that we've embraced for the last 1,800 years. Now, I want to move forward a little bit. I don't want to lose sight of this, but I want to keep it in the same lane. You actually you have a congregation on Saturday and Sunday. Explain that.
Yeah, so in 2016, we had, taking it from that story earlier where it was just three men who were studying after church, that actually grew into a home church. And then that home church grew so big, we created a second home church. That home church grew so big, we created a third home church. And in 2016, all three home churches were just at capacity. And then me fighting tooth and nail against God, got with the other two home churches and said, "Hey, we need to make a way for people to publicly come and do this in a public sense." And that really was born out of, again, more study. The Sabbath was the first of all holy convocations. That's a gathering. It's an instruction Sabbath to gather together. And so the three home churches came together in 2016 and created a fellowship. But back then it was called Beit Shalom Messianic Fellowship. Hebrew name Beit Shalom, meaning house of peace. Later on, we were sharing a building with 5 other churches. It was a really neat experience in downtown Monroe, and we just grew. We were using the church, needing it more, and not able to work around the other churches' schedules. And so we ended up at a building that is a church kind of on the eastern side of Monroe, and there's a lighthouse out in front of it. A friend of mine, his dad had started the church, and he kind of cued me in on the building. And there's a Baptist church that was going there, and they welcomed us, didn't charge us rent. Was a blessing. We were paying very little rent to be downtown. I told our congregation, we could expect to pay 3 or 4 times as much for a new building. And we got there, and his only question, the pastor who was there at the time, Brother David, he said, "Matt, I have one question for you. If you were in my situation, would you do it for me?" And I said, "I absolutely would." He said, "Then I'm not going to charge you rent if you'll help us with utilities and maintenance of the building." And when I first went to the door of that church, they had a little sticker, and it was placed on there like a kid had put it, because it's like misplaced random sticker. It said, "I love Israel." And I thought, man, I'm in the right place. And so that started a really beautiful relationship between our church and theirs. They're kind of an older church, and we started really helping out with a lot of things. We repainted the whole building. We did a lot of work. That was back in 20, I don't know if it's 21 or 22. I think it's 22.
That's COVID area. That's just after the end of COVID. So let me ask you a question about, because you're growing. Why are you growing? What were people coming to learn?
Well, I'll tell you, we started growing very shortly, small ways at our old building under Beit Shalom. When we moved to the new building, we decided to change our name because we're not in a big city where people recognize different types of language and culture. I mean, I would say Beit Shalom, and they're like, "What in the world is that?" And so we changed our name to Lighthouse, since there's a lighthouse out front, and Lighthouse Messianic Fellowship. And so then people started coming just because, but a lot of it's just the Sabbath draws people. We have service on Saturday. And so just the idea, people start saying, "There's this Sabbath in our Bibles. I feel like I should be doing something on this day." And they start Googling. Most people just start Googling, "Is there anyone around that does Sabbath?" or something along those lines. And a lot of times that's how people end up, at our church.
Now, let me back you up a minute. How many people would you say, when they started learning some of the ancient stuff, you mentioned it earlier, going back and looking at the poetry, the cultural integrity, the languages, Akkadian, all these different things. When people started seeing this, what was their reaction? What are some of the reactions of people who went, "Oh my God," that you can talk about?
Yeah, I think, years ago, I went to a retreat my friend got me to go on, that he was kind of leading the retreat. And I thought, I don't need a retreat. I'm a pastor of a church. And it was great. I needed it more than I ever thought I did. And afterwards, he said, "I want you to start coming to my Bible study." A bunch of Baptist men. And I know you got a lot that you can help us understand the Bible better. I think they were in John when I started. And I just, at the time, to be honest with you, I was going through a season of humbling. God was humbling me. If you don't humble yourself, God will humble you. And I can only explain that God had, what's that?
I said, "Yeah, he will."
Oh, yeah, he will. Yeah.
Been there, done that.
So I had been through some humbling. And when I went to to be completely frank and honest, I'd been humbled because I had started using the things that God led me to understand and stuff in school as a source of pride, like I know more than other people. So I entered this Bible study, and I had like spiritual duct tape. I didn't say a word for 18 months. I sat in there, and my friend, he called me one day, and he's like, "Hey, I'm just curious. Do you think you're better than us?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I invited you to this study because you could pour into us with a lot of your knowledge about the word, and you haven't said a word since you've been there." And I'm like, "Oh man, no." And so I kind of told him, "Look, I've been humbled." So then I started. He said something along the lines of, "Can you pray that God removes that spiritual duct tape pretty quick, because we could really benefit from your contribution." So I started contributing in First Corinthians, and when we finished the book, we went back to Genesis. And I'll tell you, this is no slight. It's just the nature of the Western church. There were quite a few men in that group of probably 30 Baptist men, or 20 to 30 Baptist men, that when we go into Genesis, they had no clue there were two trees in the Garden of Eden. They only knew the story of creation as the tree they weren't supposed to eat from. They had no clue there was the tree of life in the beginning. They knew they saw it in Revelation. And so we spent 16 months in Genesis, 24 months in Exodus, and we've been in Leviticus now for 13 months, and we're in chapter 24. And I have seen men weep many times at coming to the revelation of God's character and his grace and his love and the things that they never knew, and they wish they would have been taught from the beginning. We just went through Leviticus 23, and I'm talking, sharing the feast day and how Jesus, our Messiah, how he, emulates everything, not only just spiritually, but physically. His death, burial, and resurrection was surrounding Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits, and the Pentecost being Shavuot and all these things. And I've just seen men just totally like overwhelmed with, I wish I would have known this sooner, and my approach there, I don't teach the Bible from a denominational background or perspective. I teach the Bible for what it says and what it was intended to tell us. And I found that when we do that, and welcome, I teach in a seminar style. Most of my teaching is through questions. I want you to think about it and know it for yourself, not just me tell you what it says. And that's been really great, especially in that one group. I mean, that group has been like 4 years now, Genesis through Leviticus, and not only did they learn what it says, they've learned how to study it properly.
I had somebody recently say to me, I'm really not interested in knowledge. And I went, that's kind of almost a cliche when you're running into opposition. But I understood where it was coming from. And I went, this has nothing to do with knowledge. It has to do with going back and look at the cultural integrity of the world that these people wrote this stuff in. It's like, people look at the New Testament and they go, wow, this is revelatory, but really talking about letters. We're talking about, a few men who wrote a few letters to try to get people to go back to what Moses was talking about. And I go, it's not a new thing. It's the restoration of the original thing. And I love how Dina says it's basically the Exodus story. When you understand the Exodus story from the ancient text, then you see the New Testament as an Exodus story, and you see all the comparisons and the repetition, and the whole thing becomes, I can't tell you how many people I've had break down and cry and go, oh my God, how come we don't know this? Why didn't we know this? And, the first thing a lot of people do is get mad or get angry, and then it becomes a mess. I mean, I had to step away from the denominational Torah, Hebrew roots, messianic stuff, because the information that the Bible is bringing to us is kingdom driven, not denominational. And of course, if you stop and think about the denominations, and I've said this over and over and over again, you got the Baptist church in the neighborhood, you got the Catholic church around the corner, the Pentecostals are down the street. You got all of these different denominations, and the one thing they all have in common is they don't know each other. They don't study together. And I think that part of what's happening in the world today is that restoration back to the text, so we can understand the heart of God Almighty and what he's doing. I mean, if he didn't care about what he was doing, our behavior would not allow us to live. And because we've broken the covenant. I mean, we break the covenant every day, myself included. But when we understand that we're citizens of a kingdom and the mercy and grace that's been extended to everybody from day one, from the very first word penned in Genesis, it's kind of like he's going to fulfill his work. And the whole thing is about being restored to what he is doing. And I think, once you understand that and you take a better look at Israel and understand that plan has been released to all of mankind through this nation, through this people, through this land, then we begin to see the bigger story of why we're all here in the first place. And I just love that. Now, we've only got a few minutes left in the program, and I want to kind of give you the floor to kind of share what you would teach on Sunday. You go to a Sunday congregation too. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, so Brother David, who was the pastor of the Baptist church that we kind of shared the building with, he had a medical issue that he's now in a nursing home, and it's the church was faced with trying to find a new pastor. And by this time, about a year and a half after being there, we have grown close. I would fill in for him for preaching and stuff, and we built this really trusting relationship. And so I told him, I said, look, don't stress about going anywhere to find anybody anytime soon. I'll fill in for you. I'll just be there every week. I don't need pay. Don't pay me anything. I'm gracious for our relationship and our connection between our churches and the shared space that God owns. And so I started preaching there on Sunday mornings. And so a year and a half later, I'm still preaching every Sunday morning. But
how's that going?
It's been fantastic. They've latched on to it. People often think, well, that I would have to change the way I preach for the Baptist church. No, we're all the church of God. I'm not preaching anything crazy on Saturday morning that they wouldn't accept on Sunday morning. And so right now we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, which and they're just eating it up. And then on Wednesday nights, both churches come together for the same midweek service, and we're going through Revelation together. They've joined us for our events, like they showed up to Tabernacles, they come to Passover. And then our people, what really got me when I first started was I can just preach the same message on Saturday that I do on Sunday, not trying to cheat the system or anything, but my sermon on Sunday is 30 minutes. My sermon on Saturday is an hour. So I would just cut it down. Well, then people from my church on Saturday started coming on Sunday, and I couldn't do that anymore. So I started doing some different things, but we're going through the Sermon on the Mount. They're loving it. They're eating it up. They're being encouraged. I asked one lady, and she said, I just have not been fed this way in years and years. And I said, praise God. And that made me think of something that you were talking about. One thing that I do that when it comes to literary genres of the Bible and how the Bible is written, that helps us connect our story to Israel and see that God was making us part of his ongoing story, not creating a new story with believers in Jesus, is the book of Matthew that you mentioned yourself. The book of Matthew itself is written so that we would understand the work of Jesus in our lives as the Exodus that went through. And so I did a study with a different group a couple of years ago in the book of Matthew, and I showed them how this story, the author intentionally writes it so you see it as the renewed Exodus story. So if you think about the beginning, it's the only gospel where Jesus is under threat of death as a baby, and just like it was with Moses and the Moses story, Jesus goes to Egypt in the story of Matthew. He comes back from Egypt, and the next story that you get is him being baptized, which is related to the Red Sea and so many different passages in our New Testament. And then after the Red Sea, he goes into this wilderness experience with the enemy, Hasatan, with Satan, who Satan tests him with the same exact test that Israel was faced with in their wilderness experience, that they failed, but he is successful. And then he comes out of the wilderness experience straight on top of a mountain. And we call it the Sermon on the Mount. I think we often portray it as the Sermon on the Grassy Knoll, but the word is mountain. It's the Sermon on the Mountain. And he goes over the same instructions that Moses gave, and he says, y'all been teaching it wrong. This is how you should understand it. And then in a difference between Matthew and Mark, Jesus comes down from giving this most beautiful sermon where he's reteaching the things that God told Moses, and he performs 10 miracles. You don't find that in Mark, but you find it in Matthew, because the 10 miracles are linked to the the 10 words on the tablets that come down. And you can follow this trend all the way through Matthew. And so that's doing a couple things. One, it's for me, the author is showing his audience that this is the greater Moses with the greatest exodus that ever could be, the freedom from sin and death. But it also connects the followers of Jesus to the Israel story that, like you were saying, we're grafted in. It's not a new story. God's not doing a new thing. Richard Lentz, he's a really great biblical scholar. I can't remember which one of his books, but he talks about the redemption story and how we have to understand our place in it, where we're at today in the redemption story. And the author of Matthew was explaining to them in their day, Jesus coming and doing what he did and you following him doesn't separate you and make you something different than what God has been doing from the beginning. And I think Matthew's story helps us understand that. And so that's, again, a little bit of how we have to really understand how our Bible is written, who wrote it, how did the first hearers understand it, and so that we can really apply it in our lives properly.
I would say, and I've said many, many times as well, we need to give the scriptures back to the authors. John Walton kind of branded that into my head. It's funny, I'm going to tell you a quick story about John Walton. I was driving him to the airport, and he goes, I asked him a theological question. Now, he had just spent 3 days here, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, teaching on language, culture. So I asked him a theological question, and he looks at me, he goes, Jeff, I'm not a theologian. Kind of threw me for a curb. And I was like, you just spent 3 days teaching us. He said, I taught you the languages. He said, I'm a scholar. My academia is in the ancient languages, Arcadia, Hebrew, Syriac, all these. He said, I look at what they were writing and I try to transliterate it back so that it makes more sense. And I was like, okay, so I didn't know there was a difference. But now that I'm reading all these books, there's one book Dina gave to me. She told me to recommend it. It's called The Mythology of Eden. I can't call it. Yeah, that was one of the best books I've read because it puts you back into the mythological world that the writers lived in. They didn't live with, NASA, and they didn't live with Harvard. They lived with stone tablets and analogy and all kinds of things. In fact, boasting and we get all of these things like great big conferences and celebrations and orators. We get all of that from that world, and we don't somehow connect it to that world. But that was the way they communicated to their audiences. And again, we're a product of what they were doing, and we need to give it back to them so we can better understand what they were doing. And I believe that everything that I understand about the biblical text is that it's return to what I'm doing, come back to what I'm doing. And you seem to have a pretty good handle on that. I really love the fact that you promote the kingdom understanding of the Bible as opposed to the spiritual, all this fantastic stuff, which is not to say it didn't exist, but let's get back into the lives of the people and what they were experiencing so we better understand what they were writing. And you seem to have a pretty good handle on that. I'm just thrilled to have you on the broadcast. Now, we're just about out of time. It's starting to look like I'm going to have to figure out a way to come down to Monroe, Louisiana and visit with you folks. But I'd love to do that. But we're really out of time. I'm going to give you the last word. What would you like to say? And I want to thank you beforehand. Thank you for coming on. I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'd love to come back and really, I love to be a person that's approachable. So if anybody wants to reach out, would love to talk about the Bible, would love to help you understand anything about the Bible. I get texts every day, all day, both on a professional basis and a personal basis. One thing I didn't mention earlier, I actually work for a college now. I'm an adjunct professor of biblical literature and an
Of course you are.
So I teach Old Testament literature and New Testament literature. I do that on the adjunct side, but I'm an administrator. I'm a director of strategic planning, assessment, and initiatives for the college. But so I would just encourage people, feel free to reach out. I give my personal number all the time. I love people because that's what God called us to do. And so I love to help people understand their Bibles better. I would give one resource. If I could give one resource to people, I always love to give people something to take away. There's a scholar named Leland Ryken, Leland Ryken, Ryken. Leland Ryken. I have learned so much from his works when it comes to understanding the literature of the Bible. So he has one work. I think it's like literary introductions to the books of the Bible. And I tell people every single time I pick up one of the books of the Bible to study, I will start with that. It's a concise, like maybe 10 pages per book of the Bible, explaining every genre that's in the Bible, in that book, explaining how that genre is supposed to be read. And I would say get that book and add it to your course of study as you learn God's word better. So thanks for having me on. It's been a blessing.
This has really been a blessing. I'm going to ask you one more thing before we sign off.
Yeah.
What would you say to the person who is seeking?
Oh man, I would say to the person who's seeking, don't be scared to take it slow. Slow down, read it again, and understand that God's word. This is one thing that people in the scholarly world we don't talk about enough, but that God's word is one side of the conversation. People say, when I hear God speak, well, he doesn't speak like he used to. The Bible tells us that. Read his word. They said, no, I want to speak. I want to hear him audibly. And I tell people, read his word out loud then. But the other side of that, the other side of that conversation is prayer. And so a lot of times we can get so ingrained in the scholarly side of understanding his word, which is important. But I always try to push people back to answer the conversation. It's not a one-way conversation. So every time you read his word, please go to him in prayer. Thank him for his kingship, his rule, his authority, his sovereignty, and thank him for the word that we are blessed where I've got this phone. I can read the Bible every day on this phone, and I've got over 4,000 library books in this phone that I can pick up and read every day. It's a blessing. I don't take it for granted. That's my Logos library. It's like 4,800 books.
Dr. Matt Nappier, is it Nappier or Napier?
It's actually Napper, like there's no I.
Napper. Okay, Dr. Napper, been a blast, man. I'd love to have you back on, so keep a date open for me, all right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Folks, this is Jeff. This is the first time I've really spoken publicly with Dr. Napper. And I'm thrilled. Dina was absolutely right. I look forward to getting to know you better and watching you travel as you journey through the kingdom. All right, folks, that's it. We're out. Let's talk about it. Next week, we're going to be talking to Christina. She says something about glow, so we're going to have a good conversation. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.